The radio crackled with the kind of static that meant someone was about to die. In the operations bunker beneath Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, a room full of hardened special operations coordinators stared at a tactical display showing what appeared to be impossible. 12 Navy SEALs trapped in a canyon so narrow that satellite imagery couldn't penetrate its shadows, enemy forces closing from 3 sides, and extraction helicopters grounded by a sandstorm that had materialized like the desert's own vengeance. "Negative on air support," came the voice from tactical control, tinged with the kind of resignation that follows failed miracles. "Canyon's too tight. Predator can't get angle, Apache rotors won't clear the walls, and fast movers." The pause stretched like a held breath. Fast movers would crater themselves before they could blink. The SEALs had been pursuing high-value targets through the Khyber region when the ambush triggered. What should have been a textbook capture-or-kill operation had devolved into 12 of America's finest warriors pressed against ancient stone walls, ammunition running low, calling for salvation from a sky that seemed unreachably far above their heads. The canyon measured barely 60 feet across at its widest point, with walls that rose 300 feet straight up like the ribs of some prehistoric beast. Captain Morrison, the mission commander, rubbed his temples as radio chatter filled with increasingly desperate updates. The SEAL team leader's voice, call sign Neptune 6, maintained professional calm even as his situation report painted a picture of mathematical certainty. "Contact in all sectors. Estimate 40 plus hostiles. We've got maybe 20 minutes before they get organized enough to rush us." "Sir," came a voice from the back of the operations center, barely audible above the electronic symphony of warfare coordination. A junior air traffic controller, headset askew, was staring at his screen with the expression of someone who just witnessed physics bend. "There's a bird requesting permission to support." Morrison didn't look up from his maps. "Tell them what I told everyone else. Canyon's a no-fly zone unless they're planning to dig their own grave." "Sir, it's Reaper 7. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of concentration, but the breathless quiet that precedes either disaster or legend. Every operator in that bunker knew the call sign, though most had never seen the pilot. Reaper 7 flew the missions nobody else would take, in aircraft that shouldn't survive, through airspace that existed in the margins between courage and insanity. But even legends had limits, and the Koringal Canyon had already claimed 2 helicopters and a drone in the past 6 months. "Patch me through," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that would either save 12 lives or create 13 graves. The radio hissed to life, and when the voice came through, it carried an accent that spoke of Montana wheat fields and Sunday morning church bells. "Operations, this is Reaper 7. I understand you have personnel requiring immediate air support in Grid Sector 7 Alpha Niner." Morrison keyed his microphone with the careful deliberation of a man choosing his last words. "Reaper 7, that's affirmative. 12 souls in a canyon 60 feet wide, walls 300 feet high. Every bird we've sent has turned back or gone down trying. What's your aircraft type and armament?" The pause that followed stretched long enough for Morrison to wonder if they'd lost connection. Then came the response that would change everything. "Operations, Reaper 7 is flying a single-seat A-10 Thunderbolt, fully loaded with 30mm and mixed ordnance. Request immediate clearance to engage." Morrison stared at his tactical display, calculating physics and probability in the space between heartbeats. An A-10 Warthog was built for close air support, but it was also built like a flying tank, 36 feet of armored aircraft designed to survive ground fire, not thread needles through canyon walls. The wingspan alone measured 57 feet, leaving less than 18 inches of clearance on each side, if the pilot somehow managed perfect centerline flight through a corridor that twisted like a serpent's spine. "Reaper 7, Morrison's voice carried the weight of professional responsibility and human desperation in equal measure. That canyon's tighter than your wingspan allows. You're asking me to clear you for a mission that violates basic flight safety parameters. Copy that, operations. I'm requesting clearance anyway. In the background, Neptune 6's voice cut through the static, taking heavy fire from the north wall. They're moving to flank positions. We need air support now, or we need a miracle. Morrison closed his eyes, seeing in his mind the faces of 12 SEALs who had wives, children, parents waiting for their return. When he opened them again, his finger was already on the transmit button. Reaper 7, you are cleared hot. God help us all. Reaper 7 copies clearance. Time on station in 12 minutes. As the radio clicked off, Morrison turned to his operations staff, seeing his own mixture of hope and horror reflected in their faces. In 12 minutes, they would either witness the most extraordinary rescue in special operations history, or they would have 13 names to add to the memorial wall instead of 12. The sandstorm that had grounded the helicopters was beginning to clear, revealing patches of blue sky that seemed to mock the trapped SEALs below. In the operations bunker, technicians worked frantically to establish better communication links, knowing that precision would mean everything in the minutes to come. The canyon's walls would create a communications dead zone, meaning Reaper 7 would be flying blind except for brief moments when line of sight allowed radio contact. Captain Morrison found himself staring at the meteorological reports, searching for any advantage the weather might provide. Wind patterns in the canyon were unpredictable. Thermal currents rising from the heated stone could create deadly turbulence, while downdrafts could slam aircraft into the canyon floor without warning. The A-10 was renowned for its stability and survivability, but those characteristics had been tested in desert operations and urban combat, not in geological formations that turned aircraft into guided missiles. "Sir," the communications specialist called out, "Neptune 6 reports they can see aircraft contrails to the southwest. Reaper 7 is inbound." The next 8 minutes passed with the cruel slowness of watch time. Radio chatter revealed the SEALs consolidating their position, conserving ammunition, preparing for what might be their final firefight. The enemy forces had grown bolder, advancing from covered positions as they sensed victory within reach. "Operations, this is Reaper 7. I have visual on the canyon. Beginning approach now." Morrison gripped his coffee cup hard enough to leave fingerprint indentations in the ceramic. "Reaper 7, be advised the canyon runs northeast-southwest, approximately 800 meters long. Friendlies are positioned at the eastern terminus, enemy positions scattered throughout. How copy?" Reaper 7 copies, beginning descent. What happened next would be debated in military academies for decades to come. The A-10 Thunderbolt, designed for battlefield survivability rather than aerobatic precision, approached the canyon mouth at an altitude that radar operators initially dismissed as a sensor malfunction. The aircraft was flying barely 50 feet above the desert floor, using the curvature of the Earth itself to mask its approach from enemy spotters. As Reaper 7 reached the canyon entrance, the aircraft banked into a descent so steep it seemed to violate the fundamental principles of controlled flight. The A-10 disappeared below the rim of the canyon like a stone dropped into a well, leaving behind only the thunderous roar of turbofan engines and the prayers of everyone listening on the radio frequency. For the first time in the entire operation, the radio fell completely silent. In the depths of Korangal Canyon, 12 Navy SEALs pressed against the eastern wall heard something that had seemed impossible minutes before: the distinctive whine of a GAU-8 Avenger cannon spinning up to firing speed. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like the voice of some mechanical angel, transforming stone corridors into an amplification chamber that announced salvation's arrival with 30mm authority. Neptune 6, the SEAL team leader, had spent 14 years in special operations and had never heard anything quite like what followed. The canyon itself became a weapon as the A-10's cannon fire ricocheted off stone walls, creating a crossfire pattern that eliminated enemy positions with surgical precision. Muzzle flashes that had been tracking toward SEAL positions suddenly went dark as Reaper 7's ordnance found targets that ground forces couldn't have engaged without exposing themselves to devastating counterfire. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the SEALs, his voice barely audible over the continuous thunder of aircraft cannon fire. "How is she flying in here?" The question was valid beyond mere professional curiosity. The canyon's twisting path required constant course correction that pushed the A-10's handling characteristics far beyond normal operational parameters. Each turn demanded split-second timing, as the pilot threaded 57 feet of wingspan through gaps that left no margin for error. The slightest miscalculation would result in catastrophic impact with canyon walls that had stood unchanged since the Pleistocene epoch. But Reaper 7 flew with a precision that seemed to bend physics around pure determination. The aircraft appeared at impossible angles, engaging targets from positions that should have been aerodynamically impossible. When enemy fighters attempted to reposition to cover, the A-10 would vanish behind stone outcroppings only to emerge from unexpected vectors, cannon blazing with the accuracy of divine retribution. "Operations Neptune 6, came the SEAL team leader's voice, tight with controlled amazement. "Hostile fire has ceased in all sectors. Repeat, hostile fire has ceased. Whatever Reaper 7 is doing down here, it's working." Morrison keyed his microphone with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "Neptune 6, what's your status on casualties?" "Operations, we have 2 minor wounded, nothing that prevents mobility. But sir," the pause carried weight, "we need to see this pilot. What she's doing down here shouldn't be possible." The canyon fell quiet except for the sound of turbofan engines maintaining impossible flight paths between ancient stone walls. For 90 seconds, the A-10 continued its patrol, ensuring that every potential threat had been neutralized. When Reaper 7 finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm professionalism that had characterized the entire engagement. "Operations Reaper 7, canyon is secure. All hostile positions neutralized. Neptune 6, you're cleared for extraction." "Reaper 7, Neptune 6, how do we thank you for what you just did?" The response came after a pause that suggested careful consideration. "Neptune 6, just get your people home safe. That's thanks enough." As the A-10 climbed out of the canyon and disappeared into the Afghan sky, Morrison realized he was holding his breath. 12 SEALs were alive because someone had refused to accept the impossible as final answer. The extraction helicopters arrived 30 minutes later, their crews still shaking their heads at the radio traffic they'd monitored. By the time Neptune 6 and his team reached Bagram Airfield, word of the canyon rescue had spread through the special operations community with the speed of wildfire. But when they asked to meet Reaper 7, they were told the pilot had already departed for another mission, destination classified. It would be 3 days before anyone learned the truth about who had flown that A-10 through Korangal Canyon. The revelation would challenge assumptions about capability, gender, and the nature of heroism itself. But in that moment, as 12 SEALs climbed aboard extraction helicopters, all that mattered was the simple fact that someone had refused to let good people die when courage and skill could prevent it. The legend of Reaper 7 began that day in the depths of an Afghan canyon, written in cannon fire and carved into stone walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. But the woman behind the call sign remained a mystery, known only by her voice on the radio and the impossible flight path she had carved through space that shouldn't have allowed any aircraft to survive. Captain Morrison filled out his after-action report with the methodical precision of a career military officer, but privately wondered how he would explain what he had witnessed to anyone who hadn't been there. Some events transcend the boundaries of normal experience, entering the realm of stories that shape military culture for generations. The Korangal Canyon rescue would become one of those stories, though the full truth would prove even more extraordinary than the legend. 3,000 miles away, at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, an A-10 Thunderbolt landed with the routine precision of another training mission completed. Ground crews who had been servicing aircraft for decades examined the jet with professional interest, noting cannon residue and minor stress indicators that suggested hard maneuvering. But nothing in their inspection revealed the extraordinary mission the aircraft had just completed, or the identity of the pilot who had made the impossible look routine. Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Reaper Petrov shut down the aircraft's engines and sat in the cockpit for a moment longer than regulations required. At 34, she had logged more combat hours than most pilots achieved in full careers, but the Koringal mission had pushed her skills into territory that existed beyond training manuals and simulator programs. The canyon walls had been so close she could have reached out and touched ancient stone, while enemy fire had created a three-dimensional maze of tracers and explosions that required flying more by instinct than instrumentation. She removed her helmet, revealing auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and green eyes that held the thousand-yard stare common to combat veterans. The flight suit bore no nameplate, no squadron patches, no indicators of rank that might identify her to casual observers. In the shadowy world of special operations support, anonymity was both protection and operational necessity. The ground crew chief approached as Petrov climbed down from the cockpit, his expression mixing professional curiosity with genuine concern. "Ma'am, aircraft show any handling issues. Stress indicators suggest some pretty aggressive maneuvering." Petrov pulled off her flight gloves and tucked them into her survival vest. "Aircraft performed flawlessly, Chief. Just another training sortie." The lie came easily, part of the operational security that kept special missions classified and operators alive. "I'll need the bird ready for another hop tomorrow morning, 0600. "Yes, ma'am, we'll have her ready." The chief paused, studying stress patterns on the aircraft's wing surfaces. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what kind of training puts wear patterns like these on an A-10? Petrov shouldered her flight bag and headed toward the squadron building, her voice carrying across the Arizona desert air. "The kind that keeps good people alive, Chief. The kind that keeps good people alive." As she walked away, the ground crew chief continued his inspection, noting impact scars that looked suspiciously like ricochets from small arms fire. But asking questions about classified missions was above his pay grade, and some things were better left unspoken. He simply added a notation to the maintenance log. "Aircraft returned from training mission. Pilot requests priority scheduling for continuation training." Inside the squadron building, Petrov submitted her flight plan and mission summary to the duty officer, a young lieutenant who accepted the paperwork without looking up from his computer screen. The routine nature of the interaction concealed the fact that 12 Navy SEALs owed their lives to the quiet professionalism of a pilot who had turned impossibility into mere difficulty. That night, in a small apartment off base, Petrov sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a secure satellite phone. The call connected after 2 rings, revealing the voice of Captain Morrison at Bagram Airfield. "Operations. Sir, this is Reaper 7. Status report on Neptune 6 and his people." Morrison's voice carried relief and something approaching awe. "All 12 souls accounted for, minor wounds only. They're asking questions about you, Colonel. They want to buy you dinner and probably name their firstborn children after you." Petrov smiled, the expression transforming her face from professional mask to something more human. "Tell them I was just doing my job, sir. Any pilot would have done the same thing." "Colonel, with respect, that's complete bullshit. What you did today—" Morrison paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. "What you did today was impossible, and you made it look routine." "Sir, impossible just means nobody's tried hard enough yet. Is there anything else I can do for you?" Just one thing, Colonel. Can you tell me how you learned to fly like that? Because I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened in that canyon. The pause that followed stretched long enough for Morrison to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Petrov finally spoke, her voice carried depths that suggested stories not yet told. Sir, some lessons you learn in classrooms. Others you learn when the alternative is watching good people die. I prefer the classroom method, but life doesn't always give you that choice. The line went quiet, and Morrison realized he was listening to a dial tone. Reaper 7 had vanished back into whatever shadows produced pilots capable of impossible missions, leaving behind only questions and the unshakable knowledge that some people chose to carry burdens others couldn't imagine. In the Afghan desert, 12 Navy SEALs were already writing their own versions of what had happened in Korangal Canyon, but each account struggled to capture the reality of what they had witnessed. How do you explain the inexplicable? How do you describe a pilot who had flown through solid stone as easily as open sky? The stories would grow with each telling, but the core truth would remain unchanged. When everything seemed lost, someone had refused to accept defeat. The mission reports would be classified for decades, buried in archives that few people would ever access. But the legend would spread through military communities around the world, carried by whispered conversations and late-night discussions in officers' clubs from Ramstein to Camp Pendleton. The story of Reaper 7 would become part of military folklore, proof that individual courage could still change the outcome of impossible situations. But the woman behind the legend remained unknown to most of the people whose lives she had touched. Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Petrov continued flying missions that didn't officially exist, supporting operations that never appeared in public records, carrying the weight of other people's survival on wings that had learned to defy physics when necessary. Her call sign had been earned in circumstances that predated the Korangal rescue, forged in the fires of missions that had already passed into classified history. But the canyon flight would become the defining moment of a career that had been built on refusing to accept the impossible as permanent. Some pilots flew by the book, others wrote new chapters when the book proved inadequate. Reaper 7 belonged to the latter category, and the world was a safer place, because some people chose to carry the weight of impossibility on their shoulders, making it look like just another day at the office. The story should have ended there, with Petrov returning to the anonymous world of classified operations, and the SEALs resuming their missions with renewed appreciation for close air support. But 3 weeks after the Korangal rescue, events began unfolding that would drag the mystery of Reaper 7 into harsh daylight, forcing questions that the military had hoped would remain buried in operational security. It started with a routine congressional hearing on special operations funding, where Senator Patricia Hawkins of the Armed Services Committee asked what seemed like a simple question about pilot training costs. The Pentagon liaison, Colonel James Westbrook, provided standard talking points about simulator hours and fuel expenses, never imagining that his casual reference to exceptional pilots who exceed normal performance parameters would trigger a sequence of events that would change everything. Senator Hawkins had lost her son in Afghanistan 2 years earlier, an Army Ranger killed by an improvised explosive device during a mission that had gone wrong when promised air support failed to materialize. The tragedy had transformed her from a quiet committee member into a relentless advocate for military personnel, someone who asked uncomfortable questions about gaps between promises and performance. "Colonel Westbrook," she said, her voice carrying the controlled intensity that made Pentagon officials nervous, "when you refer to exceptional pilots, are you talking about individuals who consistently perform beyond normal parameters, or isolated incidents of superior performance?" Westbrook shifted in his seat, recognizing the subtle trap that separated routine congressional theater from genuine investigation. "Senator, we have pilots throughout the Air Force who demonstrate superior capabilities. Individual performance varies based on training, experience, and mission requirements. I'm asking specifically about pilots who perform missions that other pilots cannot or will not attempt. Are there individuals whose capabilities significantly exceed standard operational parameters? The question hung in the committee room like a sword waiting to fall. Westbrook understood that his answer could either close the inquiry or open doors that had been deliberately kept locked. In the gallery, a junior aide from the Armed Services Committee staff was already taking notes that would eventually reach Senator Hawkins' personal attention. Senator, operational security prevents me from discussing specific personnel or missions, but I can confirm that we have pilots who perform specialized missions requiring enhanced training and capabilities. Colonel, 3 weeks ago, 12 Navy SEALs were extracted from what should have been an impossible situation in Afghanistan. Multiple sources suggest that a single pilot accomplished what an entire squadron would normally be unable to attempt. Are you familiar with this operation? The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the committee room understood that they had crossed from routine oversight into territory that the Pentagon preferred to keep classified. But Senator Hawkins had done her homework, and she wasn't backing down from questions that might save other people's children. Senator, I cannot comment on classified operations. Colonel, I'm not asking for operational details. I'm asking whether the United States military has personnel whose capabilities are so exceptional that they operate outside normal parameters without adequate oversight or recognition. The question was brilliant in its construction, focusing on systemic issues rather than specific operations, while making clear that Hawkins had enough information to make the Pentagon uncomfortable. Westbrook realized he was facing someone who had transformed personal tragedy into professional competence, a dangerous combination in the halls of Congress. Senator, all military personnel operate within established parameters and oversight structures. Then why, Colonel, do I have reports suggesting that certain pilots consistently perform missions that push equipment and personnel far beyond normal safety limits? And why do these same pilots seem to exist in a classification gray area that makes normal oversight impossible? The hearing continued for another hour, but the damage had been done. Senator Hawkins had made it clear that she possessed information about extraordinary pilots and was prepared to use congressional authority to get answers. By evening, secure phone lines between the Pentagon and Air Force headquarters were carrying conversations about how to manage a situation that threatened to expose operations that relied on anonymity. At Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov was summoned to a meeting that had been scheduled with unusual urgency. The base commander, Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell, was a former A-10 pilot herself, someone who understood the unique demands of close air support missions. But the expression on her face suggested that understanding and sympathy were about to collide with political reality. Alex, we have a problem. Mitchell gestured to a chair across from her desk, her demeanor mixing friendship with professional concern. Senator Hawkins is asking questions about the Koringal mission, and she has enough information to make things complicated. Petrov settled into the chair with the careful control of someone accustomed to receiving unpleasant news. How complicated, General? She's demanding information about pilots who perform extraordinary missions. She knows about the Canyon rescue, and she's using it as leverage to investigate what she calls systematic gaps in oversight of exceptional personnel. General, the mission was successful. 12 SEALs came home alive. Isn't that what matters? Mitchell leaned back in her chair, studying the woman who had become both an operational asset and a political liability. Alex, what you did in that canyon was impossible. Everyone knows it, but nobody wants to talk about it officially because it raises questions about why other pilots can't or won't attempt similar missions. The implications hung between them like a minefield waiting to be crossed. If Petrov's capabilities were officially acknowledged, it might lead to unrealistic expectations for other pilots. If they were officially denied, it might compromise future operations that relied on her unique skills. General, what are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to prepare for the possibility that your anonymity is about to end. Senator Hawkins has the authority to call hearings, and she's already demonstrated that she has sources inside the special operations community. Petrov stood and walked to the window, looking out at A-10s conducting routine training flights across the Arizona desert. The aircraft moved with predictable precision, following established patterns that had been perfected through decades of operational experience. But she had learned that real missions rarely followed predictable patterns, requiring improvisation that existed beyond the boundaries of standard operating procedures. General, if she calls hearings, what happens to the program? Alex, there is no program. There's just you, flying missions that officially don't exist, supporting operations that are classified beyond normal parameters. You're a force of one, and that makes you both invaluable and vulnerable. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, but both women understood that events had been set in motion that neither could control. Senator Hawkins had the political authority and personal motivation to pursue investigations that could expose classified operations, while the Pentagon had operational reasons for maintaining secrecy that might not survive congressional scrutiny. That night, Petrov sat in her apartment, staring at commendations and awards that represented a career built on missions that few people would ever know about. The Medal of Honor she had received for a classified operation in Syria hung next to campaign ribbons from Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations that appeared on no official deployment records. But tomorrow might bring questions that would force her to choose between operational security and personal integrity, between protecting classified methods and acknowledging the truth about what individual courage could accomplish when backed by exceptional skill and uncompromising determination. The story of Reaper 7 was about to become public, whether she wanted it or not, and with that publicity would come scrutiny that might change not just her life, but the way the military approached the question of what was possible when someone refused to accept normal limitations as final answers. The phone rang at 0300, pulling Petrov from sleep with the urgency that accompanied genuine emergencies. The voice on the secure line belonged to Major General Patricia Kemp, Director of Special Operations for Air Combat Command, calling from the Pentagon with news that would change everything. Alex, Senator Hawkins filed a formal request for information about the Koringal mission. She's specifically requesting your personnel file, flight records, and mission summaries going back 5 years. Petrov sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the hour. General, how much does she know? She knows your call sign. She knows about the canyon rescue. And she has enough operational details to suggest someone with access to classified briefings is providing information. Ma'am, what are my options? The pause that followed carried the weight of decisions that would affect not just Petrov's career, but the future of special operations support across multiple theaters. Alex, you have 3 choices. We can transfer you to a desk job and hope she loses interest. We can continue denying that the mission ever happened. Or we can control the narrative by putting you in front of the committee voluntarily. Make you the face of Special Operations Aviation before she makes you the target of a political investigation. Petrov walked to her kitchen window, looking out at desert stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations while remaining unchanged themselves. The view reminded her that individual careers were temporary, but the principles they served could endure if protected by people willing to sacrifice personal comfort for larger purposes. General, if I testify, what happens to the other missions, the ones that still need to be flown? Alex, there are no other missions like yours. You're unique, And that's both the problem and the solution. No other pilot attempts what you do because no other pilot can accomplish what you do. The statement hung in the air between them, acknowledging a truth that had been carefully avoided in official discussions. Petrov's capabilities existed outside normal parameters not because she ignored safety protocols, but because she had developed skills that transformed impossibility into merely dangerous. Ma'am, I need to ask you something directly. How many people know about my background, about why I fly the way I do? Another pause, longer this time. Alex, your complete file is restricted to fewer than a dozen people in the entire military. But Senator Hawkins seems to have pieces of information that suggest someone with high-level access is answering her questions. Petrov closed her eyes, seeing in her mind the faces of people whose lives had depended on missions that pushed aircraft and pilot beyond normal limitations. The Canyon Rescue was just the most recent in a series of operations that had required flying that existed in the margin between skill and impossibility. General, there's something Senator Hawkins needs to understand before she makes this a public issue. Something that might change how she approaches the investigation. Alex, what are you talking about? Ma'am, I need to tell you why my call sign is Reaper. It's not what people think it is. The story that followed would remain classified for years after the congressional hearings concluded, but it explained everything about why Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Petrov flew missions that other pilots wouldn't attempt. The call sign hadn't been chosen for its intimidation factor or its relationship to the A-10's ground attack capabilities. It had been earned during a mission that had required choosing between personal safety and the lives of people who depended on her courage. Jesus Christ, Alex, I had no idea. Ma'am, very few people do. But if Senator Hawkins is going to investigate exceptional pilots, she needs to understand that some people carry capabilities that were forged in circumstances that most people can't imagine. Alex, are you saying you're willing to testify, to tell your story publicly? Petrov looked at her reflection in the kitchen window, seeing a woman who had been transformed by experiences that existed beyond the normal range of human endurance. The face that looked back showed lines that spoke of stress and responsibility, but also eyes that held uncompromising determination. Ma'am, I'm saying that if Senator Hawkins wants to understand why some pilots exceed normal parameters, she needs to hear about the circumstances that create those capabilities. Not just the successes, but the cost of developing them. Alex, once you cross that line, there's no going back to anonymity. Your story becomes public property, and every mission you've ever flown gets scrutinized by people who weren't there. General, 12 SEALs went home to their families because someone was willing to cross lines that other people wouldn't approach. If that means giving up anonymity to protect the principle that individual courage still matters, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. The conversation continued until dawn, mapping strategies that would allow Petrov to control her narrative while protecting operational details that needed to remain classified. By morning, the decision had been made. Reaper 7 would testify before Congress, becoming the face of military aviation excellence while revealing the personal cost of carrying capabilities that existed beyond normal human limitations. Senator Hawkins would get her answers, but they would come with a story that would challenge every assumption about courage, capability, and the price of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving Petrov 5 days to prepare for questions that would transform her from anonymous operator to public figure. But first, she had one more mission to fly, one final classified operation that would complete her transition from shadow warrior to reluctant hero. The call came Sunday morning, scrambling her for an emergency support mission that would prove to be the perfect capstone for a career built on making the impossible look routine. But this time, the entire world would be watching. 5 days later, Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Petrov walked into a congressional hearing room wearing dress blues that bore the decorations of a career spent in places that didn't appear on maps. The ribbon rack above her left breast told the story of someone who had served in every major conflict of the past decade, while the pilot wings on her chest identified her as a member of the exclusive community that fought wars from 30,000 feet or 30 feet, depending on mission requirements. Senator Patricia Hawkins sat at the center of the committee dais, her expression mixing curiosity with the controlled intensity that had made her a formidable investigator. To her right and left, other senators reviewed briefing materials that contained heavily redacted summaries of missions that pushed the boundaries of what congressional oversight normally examined. "The committee will come to order," Hawkins announced, her voice carrying across a room filled with Pentagon officials, media representatives, and family members of military personnel who had benefited from exceptional air support. "Today, we examine questions about military aviation capabilities, specifically focusing on pilots who consistently perform missions that exceed normal operational parameters." Petrov sat at the witness table, flanked by Air Force lawyers who had spent the weekend coaching her on how to discuss classified operations without compromising operational security. But she had already decided that certain truths were more important than legal technicalities, regardless of the personal consequences. "Lieutenant Colonel Petrov," Senator Hawkins began, "thank you for appearing before this committee voluntarily. Can you please state your current assignment and military specialty for the record?" "Senator, I am Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Petrov, currently assigned to the 354th Fighter Squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. I am an A-10 pilot with approximately 3,000 combat hours over multiple deployments." "Colonel, are you familiar with an operation that took place in Afghanistan approximately 3 weeks ago, involving the rescue of 12 Navy SEALs from Korangal Canyon?" The question that everyone had been waiting for hung in the air like a challenge waiting to be answered. Petrov looked directly at Senator Hawkins, recognizing in the older woman's eyes the same determination that had driven her own career. "Senator, I am familiar with that operation." "Colonel, can you tell this committee what happened during that operation?" "Senator, 12 Navy SEALs were trapped in a canyon approximately 60 feet wide, with walls rising 300 feet on both sides. Enemy forces had them pinned down, and conventional air support was unable to engage due to the confined space." "Colonel, what made this situation particularly challenging from an aviation perspective?" Petrov leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying the professional precision that had characterized thousands of radio transmissions during combat operations. "Senator, the canyon was narrower than the wingspan of most military aircraft. Normal safety protocols would prohibit flight operations in such confined spaces." "But someone did provide air support, didn't they, Colonel?" "Yes, Senator, someone did." The pause that followed stretched long enough for everyone in the room to understand that they were approaching the moment of truth. Senator Hawkins consulted her notes briefly before continuing, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lost too much to accept anything less than complete honesty. "Colonel Petrov, were you the pilot who provided that air support?" Petrov looked around the room, seeing faces that represented every aspect of American military service. Pentagon officials who managed budgets and policies, field commanders who made life-and-death decisions, family members who waited for news from distant battlefields, and media representatives who would carry this story to the general public. "Senator, I was the pilot flying Reaper,"